The day my house was sold, I was still alive, and I was sitting inside it. I didn't know it was sold yet. I was folding laundry in the living room when the front door opened and three strangers walked in like they belonged there. One of them held a folder with my address printed across the top. Another was already on the phone, talking about closing dates. I stood up and asked who they were. The man didn't answer me. He looked past me and asked my son how fast I could be out. That's when I realized my son was standing behind them. He hadn't come to visit, he had come to watch. His wife stepped around him, confident, rehearsed, already irritated, and told me not to make this harder than it had to be. She said the paperwork was finished. She said the house didn't belong to me anymore. I asked her what she meant. She opened the folder and pointed to a signature, my name, written on a page I had never seen. She said I'd signed it while I was in the hospital. She said I'd given them power of attorney. She said the buyers were scheduled to move in within 30 days. While she was talking, one of the women walked into my bedroom. I heard drawers opening. I heard my closet door slide. I heard someone laughing about how small the bathroom was. I told them to get out of my house. The woman looked at my daughter-in-law and asked if I was always like this. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "She's been confused lately." My son didn't correct her. He didn't look at me. He didn't say my name. He stood there while strangers walked through my life and decided how much it was worth without me in it. When I tried to step toward the front door, my daughter-in-law blocked me and said I wasn't allowed to interfere with the sale. That was the moment I understood what they had really done. They hadn't sold a house, they had transferred me out of it, quietly, legally, and in front of witnesses. After they left, the house didn't feel empty, it felt claimed. The door closed behind the strangers, and for a moment, no one spoke. The air still smelled like someone else's perfume. My living room looked the same, but it wasn't mine anymore. I could feel it. The silence had weight, like a decision already made. I stood there, waiting for my son to explain what had just happened, waiting for him to say there'd been a mistake, waiting for him to say he hadn't meant for it to go this far. He didn't say anything. He walked past me, opened the refrigerator, and stared inside like he was deciding what to eat, like strangers hadn't just measured the walls I'd painted myself. That was when I noticed the file cabinet by the hallway was open. The bottom drawer was empty. That drawer had held everything: the deed, insurance papers, bank statements, the envelope with my birth certificate and social security card. I asked him where those papers were. He shrugged. Not even a full shrug, just enough movement to acknowledge the question without answering it. His wife stepped in between us, smooth and quick, like she'd been waiting for that moment. She said the documents were safe. She said they'd been organized. She said I didn't need to worry about that anymore. I asked her why people had keys to my house. She said, because it's already sold. The word sold landed heavy, finished, past tense. I turned back to my son and asked him if that was true. He finally looked at me then, not in the eyes, but close enough to pretend, and said, "It's done, Mom." No apology, no hesitation, no explanation, just done. I asked him when this happened. He said the closing was last week. Last week, while I was still sleeping in this house, while my name was still on the mailbox, while I was still paying the utility bills that came to my door. His wife corrected him. She said the paperwork had been finalized weeks before that. Weeks. I asked her how that was possible. I told her I'd never agreed to sell. I told her I'd never spoken to a realtor. I told her no one had asked me anything. She nodded slowly, like she was dealing with a difficult customer. She said I had signed the documents while I was in the hospital. She said I'd given them power of attorney. She said everything was legal. I told her I didn't remember signing anything. She smiled. Not cruel, not kind, just practiced. And she said, that's what we were afraid of. My son stayed quiet. That silence told me more than any confession could have. She explained the process the way someone explains a warranty: calm, organized, finished. She said they'd been advised to act quickly. She said it was the responsible thing to do. She said I wouldn't be able to maintain the house much longer anyway. I asked her who decided that. She didn't answer. Instead, she said the buyers were planning to move in within 30 days. She said they'd already paid. She said delaying would cause problems. I noticed then that the spare set of keys on the hook by the door was gone. I asked where my keys were. She said they'd been collected so copies wouldn't circulate. I asked her how I was supposed to lock the door. She said I didn't need to. That was when I heard voices outside, neighbors, curious ones, the same people who'd waved at me for years. I saw them through the window, looking at the realtor sign that hadn't been there that morning. I realized then that other people knew before I did, that my life had already been discussed, priced, and reassigned while I was still living inside it. I told them they couldn't do this. I told them to stop the sale. I said I wasn't leaving. His wife's tone changed. Not louder, just firmer. She said I was interfering with a legal process. She said causing a scene wouldn't help me. She said if I made things difficult, it could raise questions. I asked her what kind of questions. She looked at my son before she answered. She said, questions about my judgment, my memory, my ability to live independently. She didn't threaten me. She didn't need to. The words did the work for her. I looked at my son again. I asked him if this was what he wanted. He said it wasn't about what he wanted. He said it was about what had already been decided. That was when I understood something clearly for the first time since the door opened. They weren't waiting for my agreement. They didn't need my permission. They had already moved on, and I was the last thing left to remove. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was tired, but because every sound in the house felt temporary. The refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, even the floor beneath my feet felt borrowed. I kept thinking someone would knock on the door and tell me it was time to leave. In the morning, my son and his wife acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, he checked his phone. They spoke quietly to each other, using words like schedule and logistics, like I wasn't sitting 10 feet away listening. I asked them how long they'd been planning this. My son said they'd started looking into options after my hospital stay. I asked what that meant. His wife answered. She said the doctors had been concerned. She said I'd been overwhelmed. She said they didn't want to burden me with decisions when I wasn't at my best. I reminded her I'd been released. I was walking, cooking, paying bills. She said that didn't mean I was thinking clearly. That was when I realized they weren't talking about the house anymore. They were talking about me. I went to the mailbox that afternoon. Inside were envelopes I didn't recognize. One from a bank I'd never used, another from a law office, both addressed to my son. I brought them inside and asked why my mail was being redirected. She said it was temporary. She said it was easier if everything went through one place. I asked where my check was. She paused, just a second too long. She said my Social Security had already been deposited. She said they'd set things up so I wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. I asked where the money was. She said it was being managed. That word again, managed. I asked to see the account. She said it wasn't necessary. My son stood there the entire time, nodding slightly, like this had already been discussed. I asked him when he'd stopped thinking I could take care of myself. He said it wasn't about that. He said he was trying to protect me. From what? I didn't ask, because the answer was standing right in front of me. That evening, a woman from the real estate office came by with paperwork. She didn't ask who I was. She asked my daughter-in-law where she wanted the documents signed. I told her this was my house. The woman hesitated and looked uncomfortable, but she didn't argue. She turned to my daughter-in-law and waited. My daughter-in-law told her everything was in order. The woman nodded and continued. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't shock anymore. It was recognition. This wasn't rushed. This wasn't reactive. They had prepared for this. I went into the bedroom and opened my closet. 2 suitcases were missing. The ones I'd used on family trips years ago. The ones I'd kept because they still worked. I asked where they were. She said they'd packed some things for me already. She said it would make the transition smoother. I asked, transition to where? She said we'd talk about that later. That night, my son told me I should start thinking about downsizing. He said the house was too much. He said stairs were dangerous. He said it was only temporary. Temporary was becoming a word I didn't trust. The next morning, a neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash. She said she'd heard the house was being sold. She said she hoped everything was okay. I smiled and said yes. That smile cost me more energy than anything else that day. When I went back inside, my daughter-in-law was on the phone. She lowered her voice when she saw me. I caught words like paperwork, confusion, and contingency. After she hung up, she told me I needed to be careful about what I said to people. She said misunderstandings could complicate things. I asked her if she was worried about me talking. She said she was worried about people asking questions. That afternoon, my son told me I couldn't drive anymore. I asked why. He said it was for my safety. I asked who decided that. He said they had. They, not him. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life. Lying there, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think yet. They weren't just selling my house. They were reorganizing my existence piece by piece. And every time I objected, it became another reason they said I couldn't be trusted. And the most dangerous part wasn't that they'd planned it. It was that they were calm. The keys disappeared the next morning. Not all of them, just enough to matter. The ring by the door was lighter when I picked it up. My car key was gone. The spare to the back door was gone. The small brass key to the shed where I kept tools and boxes of old photographs, gone. I asked my son where they were. He said they'd been set aside. I asked why. He said it was temporary. That word again. His wife said it was safer this way. She said too many keys caused confusion. She said it was easier if access was controlled. Controlled. I asked who had access. She said they did. I asked if I did. She didn't answer directly. She said I didn't need to go anywhere right now anyway. I tried to leave the house that afternoon. I wanted air. I wanted to walk. When I reached for the car, my son stopped me. He didn't grab me. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood in front of the driver's door and said it wasn't a good idea. I asked him to move. He said, "Please don't make this harder." I realized then how carefully he was choosing his words. Nothing aggressive, nothing loud, nothing that could be repeated later as proof of mistreatment. I went back inside. By evening, the house felt smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because my options had. I noticed the thermostat had been changed. The television channels were restricted. Even the phone on the kitchen wall, the old one I still used, was unplugged. I asked about that too. She said most people used cell phones now. She said landlines caused unnecessary expenses. I reminded her it was my house. She said, not anymore. That night, someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, a man stood there with a clipboard. Another one. This one asked for permission to take measurements for repairs requested by the buyers. I told him I didn't give permission. He looked past me and asked my daughter-in-law. She stepped forward and said it was fine. He walked in. I stood there while strangers paced my hallway again, measuring, writing, discussing timelines. No one asked me to move. They assumed I would. After they left, I went to my bedroom and found a stack of boxes by the wall, my clothes folded inside them, shoes wrapped in paper, labels written neatly in black marker. I asked who packed them. She said she did. She said it would save time later. I asked where they expected me to go. She said they were still finalizing options. That night, my son told me he'd taken time off work to help manage things. I asked manage what? He said appointments, paperwork, transportation. I asked if that meant I was going somewhere. He said eventually. Eventually felt closer than ever. The next day, I tried to call my sister. When I picked up my phone, there was no dial tone. I went to the kitchen and asked what was wrong with it. She said the service had been disconnected. She said everyone used mobile plans now. I asked where my cell phone was. She said it was charging, in their bedroom. I waited until she left the room and went to get it. It wasn't there. When I asked again, she said she'd put it somewhere safe so I wouldn't lose it. Lose it. By afternoon, I stopped asking questions. Not because I didn't have them, but because every question became evidence. Every objection became a note. Every attempt to assert myself was met with that same calm look, the same patient tone, the same explanation that sounded reasonable if you weren't the one being erased. A neighbor waved at me through the window. I waved back. I didn't open the door. I didn't know who was allowed to speak for me anymore. That evening, my son told me a doctor would be calling soon to check in. I asked which doctor. He said one date arranged. I asked why. He said it was routine. Routine had become another word I didn't trust. As I lay in bed that night, surrounded by boxes that weren't packed by me and a house that no longer belonged to me, I realized something frightening. They weren't rushing anymore. They didn't have to. They had already taken my movement, my money, my communication, and my space. The house was just the beginning. I was the real transfer. The letter came on a Tuesday. Not in my name, in his. I recognized the envelope before I read it. Thick paper, clean edges. The kind of mail that doesn't bring questions, it brings instructions. My son opened it at the kitchen counter while his wife stood beside him. They didn't sit down. They didn't ask me to join them. They read it like people reviewing a checklist. I asked what it was. My son said it was confirmation. Confirmation of what? I asked. His wife said it was the occupancy timeline. She said the buyers needed possession by a certain date. She said the transition needed to be orderly. Orderly. I asked where I fit into that timeline. She said I didn't. Not directly. She explained that I was no longer listed as a resident. She said that after the sale, occupancy had to match the new ownership records. She said keeping things aligned prevented complications. I asked how long I had. She said there were still a few options to discuss. Options that didn't include staying. Later that afternoon, a woman I'd never met arrived at the house. She introduced herself as a care coordinator. She said she worked with families during transitions. She spoke slowly, kindly, like I might miss something if she went too fast. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I was confused. That was the wrong word. She wrote it down. She asked if I felt overwhelmed. I said yes. She wrote that down too. My daughter-in-law watched the entire exchange from the doorway, arms crossed, nodding occasionally. My son stood behind her, silent, present, supportive in the only way that mattered to her. The woman asked if I felt safe living alone. I told her I wasn't alone. She looked at my daughter-in-law before responding. She asked if I'd been forgetting things. I said no. She asked if I'd missed medications. I said I managed them myself. She smiled and said it was good I had help now. Help. When the woman left, I asked why she'd been invited. My son said it was precautionary. His wife said it was documentation. That evening, I found a printed schedule on the dining table. Appointments, calls, meetings, all labeled in neat blocks of time. None of them had my name next to them. I asked what it was. She said it was the plan. The plan included a medical evaluation, a housing consultation, a financial review. I asked who scheduled these. She said they had. I asked if I could cancel them. She said no. The next day, a notice was taped to the inside of the front door, not facing out, facing in, so I'd see it every time I passed. It explained the conditions for vacating the property. It used words like cooperate and comply. It did not use my name. It referred to me as the former occupant. That night, I packed one box myself, not because I agreed, because I needed to know I still could. I chose items slowly: photographs, a sweater I'd worn for years, papers I could still find. When I carried the box to the corner of the room, my daughter-in-law noticed. She said I didn't need to rush. She said they'd handle the rest. The next morning, my son told me the doctor would be calling at noon. I asked what kind of doctor. He said the kind that assessed capacity. That word stayed with me all morning. Capacity. At noon, the phone rang. Not my phone, his. He put it on speaker. The doctor asked questions, simple ones, dates, names, sequences. I answered carefully. When I hesitated, the doctor noted it. When I asked for clarification, it was noted. When I corrected myself, it was noted too. After the call ended, my daughter-in-law said it went well. She said the process was moving forward. I asked forward to where. She said away from here. By the afternoon, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about the house anymore. The house was settled, sold, signed, scheduled. This was about removing resistance, and every document, every appointment, every calm conversation was doing exactly that. They weren't forcing me out. They were surrounding me with paper, with professionals, with procedures, until leaving was the only option left that looked reasonable. And the worst part wasn't that it was happening. It was that, on paper, it looked like care. They didn't tell me where I was going at first. They talked around it. They talked past it. They talked like the answer would arrive on its own if they delayed long enough. By then, the house no longer sounded the same. The echo was wrong. Rooms felt hollow, like they were already practicing being empty. My footsteps didn't belong to the floors anymore. Even the air felt borrowed. On Thursday morning, my daughter-in-law placed a brochure on the kitchen table. She slid it toward me without a word. It showed a building I didn't recognize. Brick, clean, smiling people and staged photographs, a slogan about comfort and community printed in soft colors. I asked what it was. She said it was temporary housing. I asked temporary for how long. She said that depended on cooperation. The brochure listed services: meals provided, activities scheduled, transportation arranged. It did not list privacy. I asked if I could visit first. She said there wasn't time. I asked why there wasn't time. She said the buyers were finalizing their move-in date. Again, that date followed me everywhere. Later that day, my son told me he'd already paid the deposit. I asked with what money. He didn't answer. His wife did. She said it was taken care of. She said finances were consolidated now. I asked if that meant my money. She said it meant efficiency. That afternoon, 2 men arrived with a van. They wore matching shirts. They spoke politely. They asked my daughter-in-law where to start. She pointed toward my bedroom. I told them to stop. They looked at her. She told them it was fine. I stood between them and the door. I said I hadn't agreed to anything. I said I wasn't leaving. One of the men said they were just there to prepare. He said it would make things easier later. Later was coming too fast. My son stepped forward then, finally, and told me to please let them work. He said resisting would only complicate things. He said he didn't want things to get difficult. I asked him difficult for who. He didn't answer. They began packing. Not carefully, not personally. They packed like inventory. Drawers emptied into boxes, labels applied without asking, items grouped by convenience, not meaning. I watched my life become manageable. When I protested, my daughter-in-law reminded me that stress wasn't good for my condition. I asked what condition. She said the one everyone was worried about. That night, I slept fully dressed. The next morning, a car was parked outside. Not ours, a service vehicle. My daughter-in-law said it was scheduled. She said we were going to tour the place. I said I wasn't going. She said that wasn't an option. My son picked up my coat and held it out to me. He wouldn't look at my face. I asked him if he'd ever imagined this day. He said it was necessary. The drive was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that means the decisions are already finished. When we arrived, a woman met us at the door. She smiled and said my name like she already knew it. She showed me a room, one room, a bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. She said it was cozy. I asked how long people stayed here. She said it varied. I asked if I could leave. She said residents were encouraged to adjust first. Encouraged. On the drive back, my daughter-in-law talked about timing. She said move-in would need to happen soon. She said the house had to be cleared. I asked if she planned to be there when I left. She said it would be better if things stayed calm. Back at the house, the boxes had multiplied. My name was written on them now. I asked when this was happening. My son said Saturday. 2 days. I asked if I could stay longer. He said the buyers were firm. I asked if he'd tried. He said it was out of his hands. Out of his hands. The same hands that signed everything. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off. I listened to the sounds of the house one last time. The pipes, the wind, the familiar creak near the hallway. I wondered which of these sounds would follow me. In the morning, my daughter-in-law told me to pack a small bag. She said I wouldn't need much. I asked why. She said everything else would be handled. That was when I finally understood the shape of what was happening. They weren't sending me somewhere to rest. They were placing me where I couldn't interfere, where decisions would be made without me, where my absence from the house would become permanent. Saturday was no longer a date on a calendar. It was a deadline, and I was the thing being removed. Saturday arrived without asking. No announcement, no pause, just movement. I woke up to voices in the hallway, not loud, efficient, the sound of people who knew exactly why they were there. When I opened my bedroom door, the house was already busy. 2 men near the front door, another in the living room checking boxes off a list, a truck idling outside. My daughter-in-law stood by the window with her phone in her hand. She didn't look surprised to see me awake. She looked relieved. She said it was time. I asked, time for what? She said the transition. My son appeared behind her. He said good morning like it was any other day. I asked if I could have breakfast first. He hesitated, then said it would be better to stay on schedule. Schedule. The men started carrying boxes out, the ones with my name on them, the ones without it, too. I recognized the lamp from the corner of the living room, the one my husband and I bought the year we moved in. I watched it disappear into the truck without anyone asking if I wanted to keep it. I stepped outside. That was my mistake. Neighbors were already watching. Not staring, observing. The way people do when they don't want to be rude but don't want to miss something either. One of them waved. Another asked if I was moving. I nodded because it was easier than explaining. My daughter-in-law followed me out and stood close, too close. She smiled at the neighbors and said everything was fine. She said families change. Change. A woman from down the street offered help. She asked if I needed anything. My daughter-in-law answered before I could. She said I was being taken care of. The men finished loading faster than I expected. The house emptied itself quickly when it wanted to. Inside, rooms echoed. I walked through them one last time. No one stopped me, no one rushed me. They didn't need to. The house had already let me go. At the front door, my daughter-in-law handed me a small bag. She said it had essentials. She said I wouldn't need much at first. I asked for my keys. She said they weren't necessary anymore. I asked to lock the door. She said it was already arranged. I asked if I could say goodbye properly. She said lingering made things harder. My son stood beside her, holding the car door open. I asked him if this was what he wanted. He said he just wanted what was best. He didn't say for who. As I stepped toward the car, a man approached with a clipboard, another signature, another confirmation. He asked my daughter-in-law where to place the final documents. She pointed to the hood of the car. I signed because I didn't know what would happen if I didn't. The pen shook in my hand. He noticed. He wrote something down. When I got into the car, I looked back at the house. The windows reflected the sky, not me. The door closed behind us. The drive was silent. Halfway down the street, I saw a real estate sign being lifted out of the truck and carried toward the lawn, planted carefully, straightened. The house was already advertising its future. I asked where we were going. My daughter-in-law said I'd see soon. I asked how long I'd be there. She said it depended on adjustment. Adjustment felt like another test I didn't know the rules for. When we arrived, the building looked smaller than the brochure, quieter, controlled. A woman met us at the entrance. She smiled and held out her hand. She spoke to my daughter-in-law, not me. Paperwork changed hands. My bag was taken. I was shown inside. My son hugged me quickly. One arm, no eye contact. He said he'd visit soon. My daughter-in-law reminded him about traffic. They left. The door closed behind them. I stood there alone, holding nothing, in a place that wasn't mine, while the house I'd lived in for decades stood empty, waiting for people who hadn't earned it. That was the moment the removal became real. Not when the papers were signed, not when the boxes were packed, but when the car drove away and didn't come back. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the peaceful kind, the monitored kind. The building didn't echo like my house had. It absorbed sound. Doors closed softly. Voices stayed low. Even footsteps felt instructed to behave. A woman with a badge showed me to my room again, like the first time hadn't counted. She explained the rules slowly. Meals at certain times, lights out at certain hours. Phones monitored for safety. Safety was doing a lot of work here. She asked me to sign a form acknowledging the guidelines. I asked if I had a choice. She smiled and said it was standard. I signed. That afternoon, I tried to call my sister. The phone at the desk required a code. I asked for it. They said they needed authorization. From who? I asked. They said from my family contact. I knew exactly who that was. At dinner, I sat at a table with people who didn't ask questions. Some stared at their plates, some talked too much. Everyone watched the clock. I ate because the woman with the badge watched me eat. Later, I asked if I could go outside. She checked a chart and said, not yet. I asked when. She said after assessment. Assessment of what? I didn't ask. That night, I lay in bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. Doors locking, carts rolling, someone crying quietly down the hall. I realized something then. This place wasn't temporary. Temporary places don't need so many rules. The next morning, my daughter-in-law called, not to ask how I was, to ask if I'd settled in. I told her I wanted to go home. She said that wasn't possible. I asked why. She said the house was no longer available. I asked if the buyers had moved in already. She said yes, already. I asked if I could visit my neighborhood. She said that wouldn't be healthy. I asked if my things were safe. She said most of them had been donated. Donated. I asked who decided that. She said it was necessary. That word again. After the call, I sat by the window and watched a parking lot I wasn't allowed to cross. Cars came and went. No one waved. A woman across the hall told me she'd been there 6 months. She said at first they told her it would only be a few weeks. She said they always said that. That afternoon, a man with a clipboard came to my room. Another one. He asked how I was adjusting. He asked if I felt oriented. I answered carefully. He asked if I missed my house. I said yes. He wrote it down. He asked if I understood why I couldn't return. I said no. He wrote that down too. Everything I said seemed to confirm something I hadn't agreed to. I asked if my son would visit. They said visits were encouraged. I asked when. They said scheduling depended on availability. Whose availability, I didn't ask. The days blurred. Meals, checks, quiet conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. I stopped asking to leave. Not because I didn't want to, because I could feel how the answer would be recorded. One evening, I heard laughter in the common room, a television show, something cheerful. I realized then how different my life sounded from the outside. Organized, managed, safe. That night, I dreamed of my house, not as it was, as it would be. Someone else's furniture, someone else's photos, someone else's rules. In the morning, I asked a staff member if I could retrieve something I'd left behind, a box of photographs. She said personal retrievals weren't permitted. I asked why. She said it could disrupt progress. Progress toward what, I wondered. That afternoon, my son finally came. He stayed 15 minutes. He asked if I was comfortable. I said no. He said I'd adjust. I asked if he'd been to the house since I left. He hesitated. Then he said it already felt different. Different how? I asked. He said quieter. That was when I understood something clearly. They hadn't just removed me from the house. They had removed the inconvenience, the questions, the objections, the presence. I watched my son leave, the door closing softly behind him. The quiet returned. And in that quiet, I realized the hardest truth yet. No one was coming to take me home. The confirmation didn't arrive as an argument. It arrived as routine. One morning, a staff member handed me a folder with my name typed neatly on the front. Inside were copies of documents I'd never held before. Updated records, revised contacts, new instructions. I was listed as a resident, not a guest, not temporary, resident. I asked what it meant. She said it was for continuity. I asked continuity of what? She said care. I turned the pages slowly. My address had changed. My primary contact had changed. My financial representative had changed. My signature appeared more than once. I didn't remember signing any of it. I asked how this happened. She said the family had coordinated everything. Family. That afternoon, I asked to speak to someone in charge. They scheduled a meeting for the next day. When the meeting came, 3 people sat across from me at a table, calm, prepared, smiling politely. They thanked me for coming. I wanted to tell them I lived there, that I hadn't come at all. They asked if I felt settled. I said no. They nodded and wrote. They asked if I understood why the move had been necessary. I said I didn't agree to it. They nodded again. They said adjustment took time. I asked if I could leave. They said departures were evaluated. I asked who evaluated them. They said the care team. I asked if I was on the care team. They smiled and said decisions were collaborative. Nothing about this felt collaborative. They explained that returning to my previous residence was no longer an option. They said the environment there had changed. They said stability mattered. I asked if they meant the house. They said yes. They said it had been sold and occupied. I asked if I could see it. They said revisiting past environments often caused distress. I asked if I could speak to my lawyer. They said my representative had already reviewed everything. I asked who that was. They gave me a name I didn't recognize. That was when something inside me went quiet, not calm, resolved. I understood then that every path back had been closed carefully, politely, with signatures and schedules and professional language that sounded reasonable to anyone who wasn't the one being erased. Later that day, I asked about my belongings. They said most items had been distributed. I asked to whom. They said donations, storage, disposal. I asked if any of it could be retrieved. They said retrievals were disruptive. Disruptive to what, I wondered. That evening, I sat in the common room and watched a television show I didn't choose. Laughter rose and fell on cue. People smiled at the right moments. I thought about my living room, the chair by the window, the way the afternoon light hit the floor. Someone else was sitting there now. Someone else had learned the creak in the hallway. The next morning, my daughter-in-law called again. She asked if I was comfortable. I asked if she'd been to the house recently. She said yes. She said they were repainting. I asked what color. She said it didn't matter. She told me I should focus on adjusting. She said resisting would only make things harder. She said this was the best outcome. Best for who, I didn't ask. I asked if I could have my photographs. She said most of them were gone. I asked gone where. She said donated. I asked if she'd kept any. She paused, then said she'd kept a few for family history. Family history. That night, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I touched something that was truly mine. Everything here belonged to the facility. Everything outside belonged to someone else. Even my story felt managed. The next day, a new sign appeared on my door. My name, room number, schedule. I stared at it for a long time. It was the first time I saw myself listed like a placement. That afternoon, I asked a staff member how long people usually stayed. She said some never left. She said it gently, as if that made it easier. I returned to my room and sat on the bed. I pressed my hands into the mattress and tried to remember the weight of my own furniture. I wondered what had happened to the dining table where we'd celebrated birthdays, to the drawer where I kept letters, to the small things no one thought to label. They were gone, not misplaced, gone. And in that absence, I understood the final shape of the betrayal. They hadn't just taken my house, they had removed my proof of having lived there at all. Without my belongings, without my address, without my access, I wasn't displaced, I was replaced. The answer didn't come as a confession. It came as a correction. One afternoon, a staff member asked me to confirm my financial information. She held a clipboard and spoke in the same calm voice everyone used here. She said there had been an update. I asked what kind. She said my funds had been reallocated. Reallocated? I asked where. She said the account supporting my care was being reviewed. She said the balance was lower than expected. Lower than expected? I asked how much was left. She gave me a number that didn't make sense. Not for someone who had owned a paid-off house. Not for someone who had saved carefully. Not for someone who had planned for old age. I told her there had to be a mistake. She said she would check. When she came back, she said the records matched the instructions on file.
Instructions signed by my representative. I knew exactly who that was. That night, I asked to call my son. They scheduled the call for the next morning. He answered on the third ring. He sounded busy, distracted. I asked him where the money from the house had gone. He paused. Then he said it had been used responsibly. I asked what that meant. He said debts, improvements, planning. I asked whose debts. He said it was complicated. I asked if any of it had been set aside for me. He said my care was being handled. Handled? I asked him if he'd ever planned for me to come home. He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said the house had needed too much work. He said it made more sense this way. This way? I asked him if that was his decision or hers. He said they agreed. That word meant nothing anymore. Later that day, my daughter-in-law called. She didn't ask how I was. She said she'd heard I was upset. I told her I wanted to understand why they'd done this. She said it was practical. She said the house had value now. She said waiting would have been a mistake. I asked if she meant waiting for me to die. She didn't deny it. She said timing mattered. She said assets needed to be protected. Protected from who, I wondered. She told me I should be grateful. She said many people ended up with nothing. She said at least I was being cared for. Cared for, in a place I didn't choose, with money that had once been mine. I asked her if she remembered the day she first came into that house. She said she did. She said she'd always thought it was too big. That was the moment everything clicked. The rushed paperwork, the silence, the urgency. They hadn't acted out of fear. They'd acted out of opportunity. That evening, a woman from administration came to see me. She said there had been questions about my distress level. She said agitation could affect care plans. I asked her if distress was expected when someone lost their home. She said transitions were difficult. I asked if I could see the full financial breakdown. She said requests had to go through my representative. I asked if I could change my representative. She said changes required approval. Approval from who, I didn't ask. The next day, my son visited again. He brought a bag of groceries I didn't ask for. He placed it on the table like an offering. I asked him if he slept well. He said yes. I asked him if the house felt like home yet. He hesitated. Then he said it was getting there. I asked him if he remembered the day we moved in, if he remembered helping boxes, if he remembered the first night we ate on the floor. He said this wasn't fair. Fair? I asked him if he would have done this if the house hadn't been worth so much. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. When he left, I sat alone and replayed everything. Every calm explanation, every careful step, every decision made without me. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't concern. It wasn't care. It was strategy. They hadn't sold my house because they were afraid for me. They'd sold it because it was there, because I was still alive long enough to sign, because I trusted them enough to look away. That night, I wrote everything down. Dates, names, conversations, small details that hadn't mattered until they did. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but for the first time since the door had closed behind me, I understood the full shape of what had been taken. Not just my house, not just my money, my timing. They had decided when my life would end, not physically, but practically, and moved forward without waiting for me to agree. And now that I knew why they'd done it, one thing became clear. This wasn't over. They had made their move, and I was no longer unaware.
I didn't tell anyone at first. Not the staff, not my son, not his wife. I kept quiet because quiet was the only thing they hadn't planned for.
Every evening after dinner, I sat at the small desk in my room and wrote. Dates, times, names, words exactly as they'd been spoken. I wrote down the order things happened in, not the way they explained it later. Paper remembers better than people. I requested copies of everything, slowly, one form at a time. Each request documented, each denial noted. When they asked why I needed them, I said I liked to stay organized. That word made them comfortable. I learned which staff members answered questions and which ones didn't. I learned when phones were monitored and when they weren't. I learned how to ask for things without sounding difficult. They thought I was adjusting. I wasn't. I asked for a public library card. I said I wanted to read more. They approved it. Supervised trips, limited time. Enough. At the library, I asked for help accessing public records. The clerk didn't look at me like I was confused. She looked at me like I was asking a normal question. That mattered. I learned that the power of attorney had limits. I learned that signatures obtained during hospitalization weren't always ironclad. I learned that transactions could be reviewed if timing and capacity were questioned. Most of all, I learned that silence only helps the people who benefit from it. I didn't confront my son right away. I waited until I had facts. When I finally asked to speak to him, he sounded tired, annoyed, like this chapter was supposed to be closed already. I told him I had copies of the documents. I told him I'd requested a review. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I told him I wanted answers on record. There was a long pause. Then he asked how I'd managed that. I told him it turned out I was more capable than they'd written down. His wife called the next day. Her voice wasn't calm this time. She said I was stirring things up. She said it wouldn't end well for me. She said facilities talked. I told her everything was already written down. That was the last time she threatened me. The administration requested a meeting. Different tone, more careful. They asked if I felt supported. I said I felt documented. They asked what outcome I wanted. I said transparency. I didn't ask to go back to the house. That house was gone. What I wanted was recognition that what had been done wasn't care. It was control. Weeks passed. My son stopped visiting. I heard from a third party that the buyers had discovered problems with the house, repairs they hadn't expected, costs they hadn't planned for. Timing mattered after all. One morning, a staff member knocked on my door and told me there had been an update to my file. My representative had changed. No explanation, just a new name. The phone code worked without authorization that afternoon. When I called my sister, she cried. She said she'd been told I didn't want visitors. She said she'd been worried. I told her everything. The truth moved faster once it was spoken. I was offered options, not apologies, options. Different housing, legal review, financial reassessment. None of it gave me back what they'd taken, but it did something else. It put limits on what they could still take. The last time I spoke to my son, he asked why I couldn't just let things be. I told him because things had never been left alone. They'd been handled, managed, reassigned. I told him the difference now was that people were asking questions he couldn't answer for me. He said he'd only wanted what was best. I told him the problem wasn't wanting, it was deciding without me. I don't know what will happen to him or his wife. I know there are reviews, conversations, records that don't disappear. As for me, I live somewhere else now. Not the place they chose. A smaller place, quiet, mine. I don't have my house, but I have my name, and my words, and the knowledge that the story they tried to finish without me is still being read. They thought selling the house ended it. They were wrong. It only proved something they didn't expect. I was never the fragile part of the story. I was the part they underestimated.